Surprise, honeys! Hello and welcome to your Black History Month special. Our tale for today comes in two parts. It is the stories of two separate women artists in U.S. history. We will be looking at the stories of sculptor Edmonia Lewis, who lived from 1844 to 1907, and Faith Ringgold, who lived from 1930 to 2024. Despite the differences in their socio-political contexts, the two have a lot of parallels throughout their lifetimes, so we'll cover artworks and other details to point out similarities and differences of these two very impactful women. Sources for today range several different Smithsonian institutions as well as the magazine, the Met Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, Khan Academy, Faith Ringgold's own website, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Guggenheim. There were a few others as well, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Beginning with Edmonia Lewis. The New York Times summarizes her by writing, quote, "She was gifted and ambitious. Her themes were biblical, literary, political, and mythological, but it was her race that made her an exotic curiosity. As an artist, she transcended constraints, and as a woman of color, she confronted a society that wished to categorize her," end quote. Later on, we'll go into why so many of her early life details are unclear, but what is generally agreed on is that she was born Mary Edmonia Lewis either near Albany or in Ohio in about 1844 to a West Indian father and part Chippewa mother, who made moccasins and other trinkets which were sold to tourists. The artist's Chippewa name translates to wildfire, which is why sometimes her name will include that word as well. Lewis spent time living with several different family members during her youth, including with her mother, producing such objects, in part because she was orphaned while still fairly young. She managed, however, to get a full education with financial help from her half-brother Samuel, a wealthy entrepreneur who had benefited from the gold rush. Lewis went on to study at Oberlin College in Ohio, but her experience went pretty severely south there. The Crystal Bridges Museum of Art notes that while she was attending, she was given instruction on drawing from the experienced artist Georgiana Wyatt and made her first plaster casts of classical sculptures. The U.S. Postal Service points out that Lewis's earliest known work, a drawing of the muse Urania, was made during her time at Oberlin. But this was not to last, as sources say that Lewis was targeted for her race while attending, despite the school's reputation as a haven for women and minorities. In an infamous attack, she was abducted and beaten by unidentified assailants and left for dead in a field after being falsely and baselessly accused of poisoning two white girls with the aphrodisiac Spanish fly. Lewis, showing a level of bravery I personally could never get to, decided to continue on at the school, that is, until she was accused the next year of stealing art supplies and consequently not allowed to register for her final semester. So in the end, she was forced to leave Oberlin without her degree. But I want to stop here to make an important note about her and her character. According to Kirsten Pye Buick, an art history professor and Lewis biographer, quote, "She rejected wholesale the idea of herself as a victim, glossing over unpleasantness so that her experiences were more consistent with those of other internationally renowned artists," end quote. Marilyn Richardson, who's been researching Lewis's life since the 1980s, agrees that Lewis emphasized an idea of herself as more of a mysterious, slightly untutored figure. The artist's variations on her own life story continue to confuse those of us studying her long after her death, hence our questions about her early life. After leaving Oberlin and with the financial as well as emotional support of her brother, Lewis moved to Boston to study sculpture in the hopes of following in her mother's footsteps and becoming an artist. Despite being in a more tolerant environment, she still was not in the clear, as Women and the American Story Organization, a branch of the New York Historical, points out that as a Black woman, the artist was regularly excluded from opportunities to study sculpting, in particular anatomy classes where sculptors would study the human body, which were only open to white men specifically at the time. Eventually, she was able to find a white male portrait sculptor, one Edward Brackett, who recognized her talent and became her mentor. She also, soon after arriving, met with one of the foremost anti-slavery advocates, the editor of the prominent abolitionist newspaper The Liberator, Miss Lydia Maria Child. Although Child went on to be Lewis's most powerful white abolitionist patron, she would sometimes privately express frustration with what she saw as Lewis's so-called outsized ambitions. Lewis's first works out of Boston were small portrait medallions primarily of famous American abolitionists. This was an economically smart move. Many supporters of the cause were interested in purchasing artworks which depicted the leaders of the movement during the Civil War, and her works played directly into this popularity. In 1864, Lewis saw her first major commercial success with her famous bust of Colonel Robert Shaw. Shaw was a white Union officer in charge of an infantry of black soldiers who became an iconic figure in abolitionist circles after he was killed in battle and buried in a mass grave with his black infantrymen. Our sources describe this work as a very traditional 19th century commemorative bust, which only represents the face of the man with the bottom portion uncarved. It was based on a photograph that Lewis borrowed from Child. But her patron, as the story goes, doubted that the inexperienced Lewis could create an accurate enough depiction to satisfy the Bostonian audience. The artist, as we can tell, pulled it off. In a huge financial boon, Shaw's family awarded permission to Lewis to execute 100 plaster reproductions of the work, which allowed her reputation to grow with their sales. Lewis ended up living much of her life in Rome after sailing to Europe in 1865 and joining a community of American sculptors there. The group included female artists derided by the author Henry James as a, quote, white Memorian flock, end quote. Unsurprisingly, Lewis was singled out for extra criticism on the basis of race by him and later by the press at large. Our sources say that they, quote, wrote about her sculptor's garb, a jaunty red fez. They noted her stature, short, her speech, deliberate, her manners, childlike, and her demeanor, stoic, sentimentalizing her race and gender in the custom of the time, end quote. Unsurprisingly, she went on to tell the New York Times in 1878, quote, I was practically driven to Rome in order to obtain the opportunities for art culture and to find a social atmosphere where I was not constantly reminded of my color. The land of liberty had no room for a colored sculptor, end quote. It wasn't long until her Roman studio itself became famous along with her. It was considered one of the moneyed class's must-stop locations on their grand tours, while the likes of Frederick Douglass visited her and the likes of Ulysses Grant sat for her. She worked in the then popular neoclassical style, aka utilizing ancient Greek and Roman traditions, to create naturalistic, figurative, white marble sculptures. They often sold for thousands of dollars in that day's money, with commissions coming from wealthy patrons on both sides of the Atlantic. And a couple of key notes here about her practice / explanations for maybe why so many were mad. As the New York Times puts it, quote, it was risky enough for a free woman of color to pursue such a career, but to claim marble as her medium was to tilt the Victorian conventions of the time, which decreed gentler aesthetic forms for the second sex, like poetry or painting, end quote. Even more than that, she was one of few at the time who completed the entire process of making a sculpture on her own. Others frequently created small models of their work, then hired others to complete the final product in marble. There were two reasons for this, however. Lewis both aimed to retain control over her work and thus originality, but she also couldn't afford to hire others due to financial struggles. Lewis famously made busts of Abraham Lincoln, John Brown, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and then later made a series of sculptures based on Longfellow's 1855 poem, The Song of Hiawatha. The poem narrates the fictional adventures of an Ojibwe warrior named such and the tragedy of his love for a Dakota woman named Minnehaha. The sculptures in this series are worth a closer look because it is fairly common to see Native Americans in neoclassical sculptures, but in other cases they were often idealized and exoticized, often depicted as a dying race. But Lewis's interpretations, as Crystal Bridges Museum notes, were unique. They reflected longevity, tradition, peaceful toil, and especially bonds between generations. In the work The Marriage of Hiawatha, Lewis emphasizes the characteristics of love described in Longfellow's poem, reserve, reverence, and dignity, while framing the pair still within the Victorian norm of Hiawatha expressing a protective, dominant persona over the diminutive Minnehaha. Our Lewis historian, Richardson, interprets the sculpture as a reference to the easily accessible in her Roman context example of Cupid and Psyche. She says that Lewis sees sees this as an elevation of the once savage Indians to more noble levels through this pictorializing development. The 1868 bust of Hiawatha shows an overly idealized head demonstrating the influences of classical and Renaissance sculptures, which Lewis would have seen during her travels in Rome. It's important to note that while Hiawatha was a real-life leader of the Iroquois Confederacy, the poem character is a fictitious blend of diverse Native American traditions. Even Lewis's personification contributes to the idea of the noble savage as expressed in her context, 19th century literature. But in something of a twist, Lewis uses carving methods drawn from her Roman influence as well as her experience growing up with her mother's Chippewa people. Remember that Wadsworth's Hiawatha had Ojibwe or Chippewa roots. Finally, from the series, we have the old arrow maker modeled in 1866 and carved circa 1872. This piece depicts an excerpt implying the joining of the Ojibwe and Dakota peoples after years of intertribal war, which may, as the Smithsonian American Art Museum has observed, refer to Lewis's hopes for post-Civil War reconciliation between the North and South. Lewis additionally made sculptures of historical and biblical African women with unique interpretations. A prime example is Hagar in the Wilderness, which is an unusually sympathetic portrayal of the Egyptian slave, or servant depending on the version, who was exiled for having her master's child after his wife forced Hagar to, being unable to conceive herself. Aforementioned art historian Buick sees this Hagar as, quote, a representation of the despair and dismantling of the African-American family under slavery, end quote, which manages to restore dignity to Hagar as a woman and as a mother through the figure's fortitude and faith in God's direction as she's wandering around in the wilderness. Art Story agrees that Hagar here is a metaphor for all African-American female slaves and their sustenance through faith, as they put it. They suggest that the uncovered breast likely refers to sexual assault, likely because rape was such a common crime committed upon female slaves, while emphasizing the figure's vulnerability. We also have the artwork Forever Free from 1867, which was originally titled The Morning of Liberty. Lewis made this work 2 years after Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished enslavement and, among other liberties, entitled freed people to basic human rights, such as the right to marry. Khan Academy argues that it embodies this basic and universal right, which till then had been illegal for those enslaved. The work is a life-size piece showing a standing man raising his fist with a broken chain in it and a kneeling woman at his side with more broken balls and chains at their feet. It significantly breaks with more traditional depictions of emancipation, which tend to feature passive Black Americans, especially a single Black male figure who would still be carrying symbols of oppression, like shackles. These works also tended to visually signal that freedom for African Americans was dependent on the benevolence of white men. An example of the traditional depiction is found in Thomas Ball's Freedmen's Memorial of 1875. It shows two presidents, Lincoln standing holding the Emancipation Proclamation on top of a podium decorated with a profile image of George Washington. Both watch over a kneeling Black man in a loincloth. Our sources see this as a sort of gesture of benevolence that presents liberty as a gift that's being granted by the two white presidents, rather than a return of something that never should have been stolen to begin with. In the Met's example of Carpeau's Why Born Enslaved of 1868, we see the theme of abolition represented by a bound woman in sculpture. Lewis, though, sculpts two free figures with the unique fact of a Black man standing rather than sitting or kneeling. But we're going to focus a bit more on the woman for a minute, though. It's a huge deal that she's seen clothed here. Female figures in neoclassical portrayals are often nude or semi-nude, so her dressed state challenges the sexual connotation associated with women who were enslaved. But the female figure's submissive position and her quote-unquote whiteness has been criticized by many scholars. We have to remember, however, that Lewis's figure is a freed woman performing her gendered role as defined by 19th century Victorian values. Professor Berwick explains that Lewis's representation of a freed couple, quote, falls into the Victorian cult of womanhood in which a woman signifies submission, piety, and virtue, while a man enacts the roles of being both protective and triumphant, end quote. As for the woman's perceived whiteness, this relates relates to Lewis's broader practice of refusing to share more than distant references to her heritage with the Black figures that she sculpted. The artist famously downplayed historically Black characteristics like hair and facial features in her works. She frequently gave African and Native American figures Caucasian features, which enabled her to create a kind of psychological distance between herself as a mixed-race artist and the minority subjects of her artwork to prevent the viewers from imagining the artist herself as a model. She thereby maintained a kind of visual separation from the female subjects she portrayed while still using her own status as a mixed-race artist to help promote her artwork. In this sculpture, the man's African descent is hinted at by the curliness of his chest hair, and as we see, the woman figure's features are more European and include long, straight hair. Furthermore, Lewis never created sculptures with interracial couples like her own parents, but this may be due in part to the more common belief among abolitionists of the day, including Harriet Beecher Stowe, that so-called biological families were the only legitimate ones, and biological families, of course, were the ones where the parents were the same race. This belief had the inherent sort of criticism of mixed-race children as often the product of sexual assault perpetrated against Black women by white men. Notably, her works based on Longfellow's The Song of Hiawatha share this sort of reaffirmation of heterosexual single-race relationships. Despite her patrons' disapproval of this sculpture's subject matter, Lewis completed the work, and rather than hide it in the back of her studio as Child wanted, Lewis shipped the sculpture to Boston, where it was publicly advertised and exhibited at the A.A. Child's Gallery. By this point in her life, Edmonia Lewis was so acclaimed that she was tapped to submit her work for the United States' centennial celebration in Philadelphia in 1876. Her piece was titled The Death of Cleopatra and allegedly created quite a stir for its so-called commanding realism. The work is made up of over 3,000 pounds of Carrara marble and depicts the Egyptian queen already dead, having allowed a poisonous snake to bite her as a way to commit suicide with one breast bared. This is the largest of Lewis's sculptural works, taking her 4 years to complete before shipping from Rome to Philly, and it was funded by Lewis traveling back to the U.S. several times to sell other sculptures of hers. Our sources note how important the choice was to show her already dead. It was super unusual, but Lewis wanted to show Cleopatra controlling her own death and thus having power over her own narrative. This may be because Cleopatra was and is often seen as a complex but power-hungry, sexually controlling Black woman. Quote, by distancing the queen from established conventions and suggesting a less ethnic identity, Lewis may have wished to separate all Black women from this conception of the queen, end quote. The choice of subject matter, of course, was also related to context. As Susanna W. Gold writes and Art Story cites, 19th century abolitionists championed Egypt as Black Africa and framed Cleopatra as, quote, evidence of African accomplishment and capability of leadership, end quote. But Lewis's work shows a slightly different perspective on the figure. Her Cleopatra may instead be a personification of how emancipation and its immediate after effects were rapidly starting to look bleak for Black Americans. After all, this symbol of accomplishment and capability is depicted dead here. The details of Lewis's death in London on September 17, 1907 were unknown until recently when Richardson found her death notice, indicating that the cause was Bright's disease, an inflammation of the kidneys. Her age was listed at 42, but she would have actually been 63. Our next artist for today is Faith Ringgold, who was born in 1930s New York City and who passed in 2024 in Englewood, New Jersey. Growing up in that context, Ringgold was immersed in the Harlem Renaissance and gained a huge early influence from the Black artistic and cultural flourishing. She was intermittently homeschooled due to asthma and learned to sew from her mother, the fashion designer Madame Willie Posey. Ringgold entered City College in 1948, and at the time it forbade women from enrolling in the School of Liberal Arts, so she majored in education with an emphasis on art. Her training is described by our sources as, quote, entirely conservative and traditional, end quote, with emphases on drawing from antique sculpture, copying old masters of Western art and in their lessons of perspective, light, and shadow. Ringgold completed her undergraduate degree in 1955 and was married with 2 daughters and teaching in public schools by the time she earned her graduate degree in 1959. According to her own 1995 memoirs, We Flew Over the Bridge, Ringgold was then on an unrelenting search for representation, and during that period, she had a transformative meeting with Ruth White, who ran a gallery in Manhattan. Ringgold says that fateful day, after she showed the dealer her paintings, which were still lifes and landscapes very much in line with the gallery's focus, White awkwardly responded that she, quote, couldn't do that, end quote. While on the drive back home to Harlem afterwards, the artist said to her second husband, "You know something? I think what she's saying is, quote, it's the 1960s, all hell is breaking loose all over, and you're painting flowers and leaves. You can't do that. Your job is to tell your story. Your story has to come out of your life, your environment, who you are, where you come from," end quote. This completely reoriented Ringgold's approach to her artwork, and she did begin painting from her own life. Ringgold not only traveled to Europe during the early 1960s, our sources say, she devised her own so-called super realism style as well in 1963, turning to politically engaged subject matter. Oftentimes in this super realism style, Ringgold would aim to depict black and white figures in scenes that examined racism in the context of the rise of the civil rights movement to represent, in her words, what it was like living in America at the time, end quote. One of these endeavors, and one of her most famous series, ended up being the American People series. We'll look here at 2 of the artworks from this series, one from 1963 called Between Friends, and later one from 67 called Die. According to the National Museum of Women in the Arts, Between Friends illustrates the uncomfortable interactions that Ringgold would witness between the black and white guests to interracial social gatherings held by Dr. and Mrs. Goldsberry, who were lifetime members of the NAACP at their Martha's Vineyard home. With this piece, Ringgold shows how such interactions at these gatherings were marked by uneasy tensions in spite of their outward politeness and civility, because at the end of the day, the people did not quite know how to be friends with each other, in part due to racial tensions. And we can see those tensions reflected in the artwork. There's subtle psychology going on here. For example, a feeling of airlessness and forced contact coming from the 2 women facing opposite directions, yet both overwhelming the relatively small space of the canvas. As a viewer, it's also impossible to miss that they do not make eye contact. Furthermore, the red vertical and horizontal beams of a backgrounded entryway visually divide the image, effectively isolating the 2 women here from one another. They literally and figuratively do not cross into each other's pictorial or other spaces. By showing this tension, this awkwardness and evasion that she saw in real life on the canvas, Ringgold was calling attention to the well-known yet little discussed tensions in the American social context of the day. The work also reflects Ringgold's technical experiments at that time into composing flat planes of color out of limited yet saturated palettes. Rather than using European chiaroscuros, realistic yet flat, to get high degrees of visibility in her works, Ringgold was instead turning to African idioms, which she said achieved the real look of Black people. Quote, by its decorative flat appearance, it helps project the real look of Black people. If you have a dark form and you modulate it with shadows, you have nothing. But if you flatten it out and indicate the shadows in flat contrasting colors, you have a strong pattern, end quote. Between Friends was the first out of the American People series. Our next one from 67 is the 20th. The MoMA argues that Dye's formal and conceptual ambiguities amplify the chaos of the piece, even as they sort of blur how important racial difference is to the conflict it depicts. We are left to wonder if this is a single moment or if it's sequential views of repeating characters, much less who is alive and standing versus dead or maybe just laying down. This is because the figures are inconsistent and there's a lack lack of shadows within and around them. With the narrative so unclear, the question remains, who is that imperative message die meant for? The artwork shares a parallel with another earlier American People series piece called The Flag is Bleeding. In both artworks, women act as change agents, as the National Museum of Women in the Arts says, quote, stepping in harm's way to intervene, protect, and attempt to stop the violence, but it is unclear whether their efforts will succeed, end quote. MoMA asserts that this piece speaks to Ringgold's ambition in terms of both its size and its nods to other iconic artworks. Die, or number 20, has been compared by some critics and scholars to, for example, Picasso's monumental Guernica, his response to the atrocities of the saturation bombing of a small Spanish town during the Spanish Civil War. Ringgold herself had seen Guernica and designated it her favorite Picasso painting after a visit to MoMA. Both number 20 and Guernica share a frenzied composition filled with intertwined vignettes, death and suffering, especially among them, angular forms, and an overall loss of life. They both have what's been described as a sense of modernist protest art to them. Furthermore, some aspects of the race riot imagery have been compared to those of Jacob Lawrence's The Migration series from 1940 to 42. He was another artist she admired. Even the grid pattern of Die is said to recall the monochromes of Ad Reinhardt, but its extended horizontal format as well as splatters could be seen as more in line with Jackson Pollock. Either way, the shift in the tone of these two artworks between Friends and Die paralleled the changes in social activism across the 60s. Nonviolent civil rights efforts gave way to more militant social action as several summers of protests and police confrontations occurred leading up to 1967, and the decade saw the rise of the Black Power movement as articulated by Stokely Carmichael and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Anxieties continuously rose that Black revolution was on the way, especially as Malcolm X had spoken of revolution in 1963 and 64, and Leroy Jones, soon to be Amiri Baraka, a leading light of the Black arts movement and key influence on Ringgold, announced in 65 that, quote, a Black artist's role in America is to aid in the destruction of America as he knows it, end quote. All of this led up to what was called the Long Hot Summer of 1967, during which over 100 events problematically labeled race riots erupted in Black communities across the country, most famously Newark and Detroit. Importantly, Die does not illustrate a particular riot, but portrays the violence, fear, and anger of these times while revealing a scary truth that none were safe. In the artwork, there are people of all races, genders, and ages threatened by the horrors of discrimination, especially the next generation who are represented by Black and white children spread throughout the chaos. All the while she was making such socially conscious, if not socially critical artworks, Ringgold was attempting to build her own networks around the same time. Art News reports that during the early 1960s, she wrote to fellow Black artist Romare Bearden requesting to join his freshly formed Spiral Collective. Bearden wrote back that he enjoyed her slides and not to despair but to continue to work hard, though he did not accept her into the group. Apparently not long after, though, Ringgold went on to meet Amiri Baraka, then Leroy Jones, after spotting the red and green black Marcus Garvey flag outside his building one day. This introduction landed her a slot in the publicly staged show that his Black Arts Repertory Theater was hosting in Harlem in the summer of 1966. Also in 1966, Spectrum, a Manhattan co-op gallery run by Robert Newman, invited Ringgold to join its roster as its only Black member. The group was heavy on the New York School abstraction style and voted her in on the strength of her American People series. Ringgold developed several artworks with the support of Spectrum's director, Newman, who supplied her with a studio to work out of, which was a gallery empty for the summer. The space allowed her to create the scale of works that she wanted for her solo show, which was put on a calendar for late 1967. She later recalled that Newman, quote, wanted me to depict everything that was happening in America, the 60s, and the decade's tumultuous thrusts for freedom, end quote. One of these artworks was American People Series number 19, U.S. postage stamp commemorating the advent of Black Power. The artwork demonstrates what many critics see as dual loyalties by, maybe ironically, blending and mutually validating Black nationalism become with an icon of the American state. Ringgold did not contain her activism to her art, however. The Guggenheim writes that she demonstrated against the exclusion of Black and female artists by New York's Whitney Museum of American Art and the MoMA between 1968 and 1970. More specifically, she mobilized demonstrations in 68 when the Whitney organized a show about 1930s American sculpture that included 0 Black artists. Well-respected art critic Lucy Lepard said in a photo interview with Art News, quote, "Faith was the one who just took the bit in her teeth and ran with it," end quote. By 1967, especially with the Black Power movement's embrace of racial pride, Ringgold starts to examine the multiple social and formal resonances of the color Black, largely through her series Black Light, which she began that year and continued through 1969. The series is seen as part of her development of an energetic activism for redressing museums' underrepresentation of artists, curators, audiences even, of color. She would quickly go on to expand into free speech, feminism, and prison reform as well. The most notable thing about the Black Light paintings is that not one includes a single instance of white paint nor white figures in its composition. The series aims to represent Blackness as powerful, joyful, autonomous, and is, quote, "a foundational body of work increasingly recognized for their powerful formal and social investigations of the color Black," end quote, according to MoMA. The AIC describes the series as looking to shift the Western traditions of oil painting, quote, "by substituting the conventional base pigment of white with Black," end quote. I realized I keep doing that. I mean the Art Institute of Chicago when I say AIC. We'll take a look at Black Light series number 7, Ego Painting from 1969, which was one of the first works that Ringgold incorporates text into. There's a lot of borrowing going on in this artwork, so we'll start there. It takes design elements from the political posters that she was creating at the same time. It uses a compositional format, a square divided into 8 triangles, featuring her name as both visual form and content, which was taken from the textile designs of the Kuba Kingdom of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Importantly, this square divided into triangles shape was a recurring format in her works around this time. Here, both image and text are fully integrated into the red, black, and gray composition, which is slightly different from other variations. Although Ringgold started moving away from painting in the 1970s, this very powerful body of early work launched her into the lineage, the discourse of painting, while also, a lot of art historians argue, capturing a pivotal and profound moment of United States history. In the 1970s, Ringgold decides to change things up a bit. She teaches college courses from 70 until 73 and quit teaching in New York City public schools to devote more time back to her art again. She continues to focus all this time on her feminist and racial politics. The artist was arrested in 1970, for example, for desecrating the American flag as a participant in the People's Flag show held at the Judson Memorial Church of New York. She additionally co-founds Black women's group like the Women Students and Artists for Black Liberation with her daughter Michelle Wallace. She founded an organization called Where We At together with Kay Brown a year later, which was a non-activist, socially conscious exhibition group for Black women artists in 1971. Now, as we hinted at in the early 70s, she begins to abandon traditional painting, especially following a second trip to Europe in the early 70s. Ringgold starts making these Tibetan Tanga-inspired works out of unstretched acrylic paintings on canvas. They often had very luxurious fabric borders. Ringgold also begins working with her mother, the fashion designer, to fabricate elaborate hooded masks out of fabric, beads, and raffia, which were often inspired by African tribal costumes. Along with these masks, Ringgold began making fabric dolls and larger stuffed figures, which often resembled real individuals. During the early 70s, Ringgold continued to design posters like Woman Free Yourself from 1971. They often often featured political statements in the sort of triangulated patterns inspired by African Kuba textiles, as we see in our featured blacklight painting. Ringgold used some of these works in her performance, capital P performance pieces, as early as 1976. The first of these artworks performed was called Wake and Resurrection of the Bicentennial Negro in 1976 by students using her masks, life-size figures, and tankas, along with voice, music, and dance elements. In the 1980s, Ringgold expanded the format of her tanka paintings to quilt size, with her mother piecing and quilting together the first of these new works. For example, Echoes of Harlem, 1980, the year before her death. Despite the tragedy, Ringgold continued to innovate and in 1983 started to combine images and handwritten text in her famous painted story quilts, which convey imaginative, open-ended narratives in what is often considered a unique medium and style. One quilt from that year, 1983, is titled Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima? Of it, the Guggenheim says, quote, Ringgold's use of craft techniques ignored the traditional distinction between fine art and craft while demonstrating the importance of family, roots, and artistic collaboration, end quote. Most importantly, this new style, this story quilt with its images and words in various formulations, allowed her to sort of publish her previously unedited words. For that reason, the story quilts have been seen as a huge leap forward in her practice. And from 1984 until 2002, Ringgold was a professor at UC San Diego and continued to innovate and reinvent her style. She created new original series of paintings and story quilts at least once every decade, with subject matter ranging from childhood memories to the U.S.'s legacies of both racism and sexism. In 1990, Ringgold initiated what the Smithsonian American Art Museum calls her most ambitious tribute to her mother, titled The French Connection, created between 1990 and 97. It is a 12-part story quilt narrating the 1920s journey of Willia Marie Simone from Harlem to Paris. Notably, it emphasizes her encounters with European artists and influential Black women. And in 1991, Ringgold adapted her story quilt titled Tar Beach from the Woman on a Bridge series of 1988 into an eponymous children's book whose critical and popular success has led to the development of several other children's publications by Ringgold, plus her 1995 memoirs. And of course, last year we were sad to hear when she passed. So you probably heard them as we were going along here, honeys, but it's time to take a close look at the key parallels, the legacies and impacts of each of these two great women. Some of the parallels are very obvious. They are both Black American women artists who imbued political and social context and commentary into their often figurative artworks, both across their lifetimes. Both of them grew up in artistic environments and both lived through massive changes in said contexts. Both also benefited, stylistically especially, from their travels abroad. Ringgold only passed away in 2024, but we are sure as time goes on, further insights can and will be made into her legacy with further parallels drawn. I found two quotes, one from each of them, that I think best summarize how their oeuvres speak to each other and how they were similar people. The Smithsonian quotes Lewis saying, "Some praise me because I am a colored girl and I don't want that kind of praise. I had rather you would point out my defects, for that will teach me something," end quote. And Ringgold was once quoted saying, "I create work that pleases me, that thrills me, that speaks to me, but it has to tell a story that is profound," end quote. Both were concerned with their merit. Both were concerned with artwork that had a meaning and an impact, and both did not want to be reduced solely to their identity. Maybe the most important parallel is that in both Lewis and Ringgold's cases, their most important creations signaled their particular emphases on subjects with social significance. Frequent customers of Lewis's included those art collectors who supported American abolitionists and those who enjoyed popular literature about Native American subjects. And as we have seen, the early phases of Ringgold's career, overshadowed, of course, by her later narrative quilts and prints, children's books, even an animated TV program might be interpreted as a series of inspirational history lessons in Black agency. Lewis's sculpture, as well as Ringgold's artworks, often did so through female protagonists. But where the two differ is some of the more fascinating ground. Ringgold emphasized her heritage, her Blackness, and difference, while Lewis downplayed all of the same things, especially in her artworks. Lewis chose a respectable medium and a popular style, but Ringgold proudly made artworks that were antithetical in both form and content to the aloof, ostensibly apolitical modernism that dominated the New York art scene and well beyond. She did so especially by creating psychological snapshots of the Black experience of the transitioning civil rights movement. That being said, however, it's important to remember that Lewis has often been seen as a concept, an artist whose work can only be viewed through the two lenses of race or gender. That has tripped up many of her supporters and contributed to the muddiness of her biography in the decades after her death. It still affects modern-day critics who would cast Lewis as a picturesque exotic, a subversive feminist, or a racial activist. We do not see the same thing happening with Ringgold, where she is only reduced to race and/or gender, at least not as obviously. In fact, the levels of celebration and fame surrounding each of the two artists may be tied to sexist ideas about the mediums that they each worked in, marble sculpture versus paint and later multimedia, as well as other biases. Back in January of 2022, the U.S. Postal Service celebrated Lewis as the 45th honoree in the Black Heritage Stamp Series during an issuing ceremony at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, with its chief retail and delivery officer serving as the dedicated official. The officer, Dr. Joshua D. Collins, said, quote, "The Postal Service is proud to honor this great American sculptor with a beautiful commemorative forever stamp," end quote. Compare this to the more mixed bag that the reception of Ringgold's quilts have seen. Many argue they've never been quite taken seriously by most major museums, perhaps because of their craft via textile associations, as well as their whimsical range of subjects or faux naive painting style. None of these quilts are owned by the MoMA nor the Whitney Museum, though the latter has a 1971 collage calling for the release of Angela Davis by Ringgold. Meanwhile, the Guggenheim has owned the Tar Beach quilt since its 1988 making, but has never put it on view in New York. And finally, honeys, the biggest difference, and probably why their life stories diverge as much as they do, Lewis was not completely without flaws herself. She, in fact, had pretty significant prejudices of her own. At one point, she dismissed her usual origin story of growing up wild with the Indians, saying to the San Francisco Chronicle in 1873, while the Western states were at war with Native Americans, quote, "I have Indian blood in me, you know. Why, do you know I almost envied the freedom of the Indians which I saw on the plains, but then they were so dirty, I didn't like that in them," end quote. Art history professor Buick argues that you have to ignore such a blatant piece of racism when dealing with Lewis's legacy, and that is partially why her story gets so garbled. Ultimately, honeys, in spite of their similarities and their differences, these are two of the most important names in American art history, especially when it comes to Black women artists. I hope you've enjoyed our special for this grand Black History Month. I hope you've learned something about these significant, storied artists. We are going to leave you here for the day and just be back with a new business on Tuesday. As always, take care, stay warm, hydrate or dihydrate, and we will talk soon, honeys. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.